Good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Bruner. I'm the exotic forest pest educator with the Department of Entomology at Purdue University. Tonight, I wanted to venture into one of our less talked about topics, namely invasive pathogens or invasive diseases that affect our trees. We have a few different ones present in the United States. Many of them do a significant amount of damage, and perhaps one of the deadliest is the one we're going to be addressing this evening, oak wilt. If you have lived in Indiana for any number of years now, you're probably very conscious of the presence that oak trees have in our state. Just a little bit of background on this, because a lot of us native Hoosiers, we kind of take it for granted, but it's always good to have a good idea of what we're talking about first. So Indiana's home to at least 17 species of oak, though that number may have shifted since that data was taken. And those oak species are split into two distinct groups. So we have one group, the red and black group, that contains one set, and the white oak group. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because the group an oak belongs to is actually going to determine how much of an impact the disease will have on them after infection occurs. Now, something that's very, very important to keep in mind when we talk about oak wilt, there is no cure. So you will not be able to recover damage on a tree that is suffering from oak wilt, and there is no prescription to try to recover it. So that tree must be removed to save the other oaks around it. So please keep that in mind as we go through tonight's information. So to give you an idea of our two oak groups and which ones belong to it, I just put up a few examples here that hopefully a lot of us are at least somewhat familiar with. So in our red and black oak group, we have what you would expect, red and black oaks, of course. We also have pin oak and shingle oak. So right now where I'm sitting, there is a pin oak right outside my window that I can see. And then if we look at our white oaks, we have bur oak, chinkapin oak, white, and swamp white oaks. And I know that there's a chinkapin oak not too far from me right now. And these are all oaks that you can find in Indiana. These aren't anywhere, like I'm not talking about ones in some random state. These are ones that are native to Indiana that you can easily locate. Now, the ones that I have listed here are more generalized in the locations where they're going to be present. However, some oak species, those of you in northern Indiana may be less familiar with, because some of them, for example, our swamp white oak, may like moister grounds. They may like associated wetlands a little bit more, which are a little bit more common in southern Indiana. Certain oaks only appear in some very, very isolated locations in Indiana, at least from the last time data was taken from it that I was able to find. So there is a difference as you go north to south in the state. You may not see all these different species. And there are quite a few of them. I didn't list them all. I just mainly wanted to give you some examples to look at. Now, if we look at some of the historical information regarding oaks, from a Forest Service survey as of 2016, and granted that information is 8 years old, it indicated that the combined oak hickory forest type, we have several different forest types that the Forest Service will reference, oak hickory being one of the most common. This forest type made up approximately 71% of forested land. And let's be honest here, if you live in any urban area that has trees, most likely oak trees are the dominant species around you right now. Right where I'm sitting, there are probably 7 or 8 oak trees within 100 feet of my home. So this is a tree that dominates. Our streets are named after them. They are all over Indiana. And right now, the amount of forested land, it takes up about 1.5 million acres in our state. So that is a big chunk of land that are just covered with that combined oak and hickory, on top of all of the other forest types that we're going to see. The reason I say this is because I just want to impress upon everyone that what we've taken for granted as Hoosiers for so long, there's a reason we take it for granted. It makes up a huge amount of the land we see. But now put that in the context of there is now an invasive pathogen that is always fatal when it infects an oak tree. That could mean a loss that we don't want to consider, which is why I'm talking to you this evening and for those of you listening on YouTube. So now why don't we go ahead and go over just a little bit at the start of symptoms. And we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into this as we go a little further on. But just to start, symptoms can be seen early summer, early June. But this depends on how far south you are. Sometimes that can appear earlier. If you go further north, it may appear later. Temperature obviously is playing a role in this, and most likely the amount of moisture surrounding you because this is a fungal pathogen. You're going to see that infected leaves initially in the tops of the trees may take on a bronzed or tanned appearance, just like in that previous slide I showed you. So this one, I apologize for the picture quality, it is grainy, but you can see that these oak leaves are taking on that very clear tan or bronze appearance. Now, it's important to understand that they won't always take that appearance. They will quite a bit, but sometimes the leaves will stay green. You will also see the sapwood begin to develop dark streaks, pardon me, in branches 1 inch in diameter, and you will also sometimes see that streaking inside of just under the bark of the wood or in thicker branches. It just depends on how infected the tree is, I imagine. So a little bit more on on the discoloration of a lot of these leaves. Like I mentioned, bronzing doesn't always occur. But it will occur regardless of which oak group you belong to. So whether it's a red and black group or a white group tree, the bronzing can occur. It doesn't discriminate between the two groups. You're going to see that the leaves may initially appear to wilt, and then the color change will start at the tips and begin to spread through the leaves, stopping at interveinal sections or the midrib. So that they're going to kind of go down to where there's a vein and then suddenly stop. Normally, that color difference, it's going to have a very, very clear line on it. It's going to be very distinct. This will separate it out from a lot of different effects. Certain pathogens may not have that clear, distinct line. Sometimes pesticide exposure may not have that kind of clear distinction there. This one is a very, very trademark appearance of when oak wilt infection begins to take hold. And then just an example of some streaking in sapwood. There are quite a few pictures on this that I got, but I wanted to kind of demonstrate it sort of in the field here. And I also want to make sure that it's clear that a lot of the images I have here, these are not my work. A lot of them come from Michigan State or Ohio State universities, and I want to make sure the people who took those images are getting credit for their work. Now that little dark streaking you see there in smaller branches where that 1 inch diameter comes into play, you can cut into those branches and you will see that streaking go all throughout them. And it's very, very obvious when you find it. Now, I mentioned that depending on which oak group you belong to, that's going to have more pronounced differences, or it's going to create a difference between how the infection is going to look. So what this means is that red and black oaks are much more susceptible than white oaks. So symptoms are going to appear more rapidly and become more pronounced, whereas white oaks, generally the symptoms are going to be significantly less pronounced. However, it's important to understand that white oaks, even if the symptoms aren't pronounced, if it's infected, it's effectively carrying that disease now. And eventually that tree will most likely die. This disease is fatal, even though white oaks may take a lot longer to die. Symptoms in white oaks are going to appear in individual limbs initially, and then they're going to spread. So in a red and black oak, the symptoms, basically you're going to be looking at the crown of the tree, and then it's just going to spread downwards. In a white oak, you're going to see branches in the crown begin to get infected, but it won't spread quite as quickly. So in red and black oaks, that leaf bronzing is going to appear very, very quickly in the crown. That is where you are going to look for the initial effects, in the crown and the tops of the trees. Sprouting is going to begin in the lower portion of the trunk. So you're going to get adventitious growth at that portion because there is now a thick fungal pad that will develop under the bark of the tree as the infection grows. And that thick fungal pad is cutting off the tree's vascular system. It's blocking up those channels that carry water and nutrients. So the top of the tree begins to suffer the most from the disease, and the tree, as an emergency action, tries to sprout new foliage and new branches below the infection point in an attempt to survive. But unfortunately, it won't be able to survive. Red and black oaks, if the infection is serious enough, will die within 1 to 2 months. And that's kind of a worst case scenario, but keep in mind, this disease spreads, which means you got to act on it quickly once you know it's there. And to give you an idea of what this fungal pad looks like, this is where some bark has been shorn away, so that way you can see the pad as it develops. It looks like a very, very nasty black mold developing on top of or underneath the cambium tissue, underneath the bark, and it's just growing into xylem right there. This tissue will have an unusual smell. It's going to have this fruity smell. So if you walk by a red or a black oak, you notice it's got some stress on it, and you can smell that fruity smell. That means that most likely it's infected with oak wilt. And that smell will actually come into play in a little bit here as I talk about this more. These fungal pads are called pressure pads because what they do is as they grow under the bark, they're going to keep pushing against that bark. And eventually, as it grows, it's going to crack the bark vertically. And it's going to make this obvious wound on the tree. And that's a really, really good indicator that it's present there. And by the way, once this starts happening, I should emphasize this tree is on its way out. It needs to be removed because this is going to be a source of spores. So let's take a moment to step back here. Let's go back to our leaf symptoms real quick. So I mentioned that our leaf symptoms, we see the leaves are becoming tan or bronzed. They're going to have that funny appearance to them. Think a little bit to some of the other plant diseases you might be familiar with. For example, let's talk about septoria in tomatoes. You see funny black or gray spots appear on the leaves of tomatoes. These are the fruiting bodies of the fungus that's infecting the tomatoes. However, spots like that are missing on these leaves. That means the leaves themselves are not the thing that's going to be spreading around as much of the spores. I would want to double check that information a little bit. However, this is an excellent source of spores. It's going to help spread it around using the vectors that oak wilt was going to take advantage of. And I'm going to talk about those vectors here momentarily. So getting into that now, let's address the pathogen itself. Let's talk about what this actually is. So oak wilt's caused by a fungus, Brachyella vagacerum. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It was formerly Cerotocystis vagacerum, so it's gone through a name change. So if you look online, if you try to look up oak wilt, you will find different sources reference one of these two names. Sometimes they will use the old name. That way, if you look it up, you know which both names you can look it up under. This is an invasive species. This pathogen is invasive. However, research has not yet told us where it comes from. It was first detected in our country in 1942, and there is some suspicion that it could have arrived from Central or South America, but research has not yet told us where that origin point is, so we don't even know how it was introduced. All we know is it just started appearing, and it is not native. It is not a part of our native fungal ecology. Now, oak wilt is going to spread through a few different ways. One of those ways is going to be insect activity, and I'm going to show you the insect shortly, what that's going to look like, or through root grafting. Root grafting is when underground trees that are planted near each other, their roots will combine and become interconnected, and the two trees are going to start sharing nutrients and water through those roots. Unfortunately, this means that they will also share pathogens. Root grafting is the primary way that this fungus spreads. Now, the insect that spreads them, something known as sap-feeding beetles or nitidulid beetles, feed on the pressure pads under the tree. So what you're looking at here are those beetles right by those pressure pads. What they're doing is that fruity smell that's coming out of those pressure pads, that's intended to attract these beetles to them. Oftentimes, you're going to find that bark beetles and sap-feeding beetles have a symbiotic relationship with different fungal pathogens or just different funguses in general. Oftentimes, their bodies will have developed pockets where they can carry different spores and other things with them and spread them to their different hosts. And what they're going to do is they're going to go ahead and farm out those fungi so that way they can feed on them. And thus, they have this great symbiotic relationship with them. Unfortunately, this means that oak wilt spreads very, very easily thanks to the presence of these beetles and through root grafting. Now, some of the things I also looked up too wanted to indicate that if you cut down oak wood that is infected and you move it around, you could potentially spread this, which, yes, logic does say that is a threat. However, it's going to be more likely that oak wilt will infect an individual tree, and then it's going to spread it from tree to tree through root grafting or through insect activity. But I also want to make sure that I just keep repeating the same thing I always say. Please don't move the firewood. Burn it where you cut it down. So a little bit on the management of oak wilt. What I'm showing you here, and what I'm going to talk about very briefly here, is some work done by an extension educator in Ripley County named David Osborne. Dave is a drone pilot who works with the Southeastern Purdue Agricultural Center. And what he did is he used his drone to map out and identify oak trees that were dying of oak wilt. So working with the Southeast PAC, they went ahead and flew the drone. They identified infected oak trees, and then they used the light being reflected off the leaves of the trees through some data analysis software to go ahead and map out those areas that were hit the hardest. And what they were able to do is once they discovered that oak wilt was present, here's some dying trees, here's where that tree is located, they went ahead and used that data to go ahead and remove and destroy the infected trees. And they went ahead and removed a lot of the trees that were, by appearance, uninfected and turned them into saw timber. So that way they weren't going to have to worry about the disease spreading further out. And this is just an example of some of the work that's being done to try to manage oak wilt in Indiana. And I particularly love it too, because I'm a drone pilot. I like using my drone to work on invasive species. And I thought this was just a great thing and a great example of this. And I want to encourage all of you to look up some of the work that our agricultural centers have been doing. It's not all about corn. A lot of it involves our forestry, and they're doing some great work. So a little bit more on the management of oak wilt. So I keep repeating this because it's important. Without a cure, the oak can't be recovered. Infections will spread. So that means that we need to remove those trees. And some of those trees may not show signs of infection. And I've heard some research indicating they could potentially be carriers because since they're dying so slowly, they're just going to end up spreading it everywhere anyways as beetles begin to feed on things or through their roots, most likely through root grafting. The only management path that exists to us right now is prevention. We have to stop oak wilt from reaching trees. There is no other really good option there. Typically, this is going to involve some professional help because a lot of it is going to involve using equipment that not a lot of people are familiar with to try to disrupt things like root grafts. So first and foremost, the thing to keep in mind is that fresh wounds are going to attract the beetles. The beetles are going to home in on plant volatiles given off by oak and other trees that tell them the plant is injured and they have an entry into the space under the bark, that there's something going on. There's probably going to be fungus developing in that wound. The risk is going to be highest from March 1st all the way through the end of November, especially right now since our warm season is lasting longer and longer and we're getting more moisture. Now, what you want to do is during that time period, avoid any and all pruning. I can't stress that enough. Time your pruning. You don't want to prune when the tree is going to be doing nutrient uptake. You need to wait until it is dormant or during dormancy. But if you have no choice and you must prune the tree, say it was injured in a storm or something like that, immediately treat it with wound dressing. This is one of those few times where wound dressing is actually a recommendation. And I want to stress for those of you who are arborists or foresters who are concerned about this or who work professionally in this field, don't use climbing spikes or any other equipment that intentionally creates a wound. That's just going to make your job harder. So avoid doing that at all costs. Now, like I said, transmission is most likely going to take place underground. Root grafts are going to be the biggest source of issue because all you have then is you have one oak that's connected to several others that can then act as a point of spread that will never see. So that means disrupting those root grafts becomes the primary objective. Any trees within 15 feet of each other need to have their root systems disrupted. And this takes equipment and it takes professional help. The equipment, I was actually not familiar with it when I was designing this program, so it was interesting to learn about a vibratory plow, but that does require someone who is knowledgeable in the use of that tool. The other thing too that's going to be important as you make considerations towards that is that you need to watch for obstructions underground. So if I use the example of my neighborhood, a lot of our oak trees are planted very close to the streets. And there are a lot of telecommunication, gas lines, water lines, all sorts of stuff under the roads throughout my hometown. So that's going to be important that if oak wilt ever reach me, I need to make sure that I'm on top of that and I'm contacting the proper people to know where I'm not supposed to dig. Now, the biggest question that I know a lot of people are going to have are going to be, can we use fungicides to combat oak wilt? Yes and no. If it's after infection, you could treat the tree with fungicide and it will kill oak wilt. However, the damage has been done. By the time you notice the tree is suffering from the disease, the tree already needs to be removed. And you don't know how much sporulation has already happened at that point. So prevention becomes much, much more important. And there is a recommendation. Propiconazole is the chemical that is primarily recommended for this, and when used and applied correctly, it can provide protection between 2 to 5 years, probably depending on disease pressure as well. But I wouldn't try to use this with just fungicide alone. I think that your best bet is probably going to be a combination of doing root disruption if there are any trees within 50 feet, as well as going ahead and applying that preventative fungicide. Please keep in mind, if the tree is already infected, you need to get rid of that tree and you need to begin protecting the ones nearest to it. So, what are the first steps? How do you get started with this process? What do you want to do first? First and most important, this is something that I really kind of struggled with as I was starting my learning journey on this one, is that oak wilt symptoms look a lot like a whole bunch of other things. That leaf discoloration that I was showing you earlier, that is the same thing that happens when an oak tree goes through drought, when it goes through nutrient deficiency, when it goes through iron chlorosis, or when an oak tree is being attacked by insects, which is what I was most familiar with, because that looks a lot like the damage being done by a red oak borer. This is a native beetle to the US, so this isn't anything new. It will bore into oaks and it will do a lot of very similar things. If you look up the diagnostic information for this insect, what you're going to find is the first thing to look for are bronzing or wilting of the leaves starting at the crown of the tree and then slowly spreading downwards. The reason for this is because that beetle is boring through the vascular system of the tree and effectively doing the same thing that the fungus would do. The result is going to be the same. So what we want to make sure that we encourage everybody to do, since this can look like several other things, is send in samples to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory at Purdue. This I cannot stress enough. You're not going to be able to diagnose this confidently without sending in a sample. I could make guesses and I can make educated guesses as to whether a tree is infected with oak wilt or not, but oaks suffer from a massive complex of diseases, decline, and pest issues, and I would not be confident in saying, yes, that tree has oak wilt, or no, it does not. So I say this a lot. I want you to send things into the PPDL so that way we can go ahead and analyze it. So I'm going to walk you guys through how you can do that, just to be sure. So if you search on Google if you literally type in Purdue PPDL or Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab, it will land you on this web page. And if you click the button that's highlighted in that red box that says Submit a Sample, it is going to bring you to this page. And this page has links on it that are going to guide you to how you can send in a sample to them, whether it's going to be a sample through pictures or an actual physical sample for them to go ahead and analyze in the lab. And the thing that I really want to highlight is the cost. This only costs $11 for residents of Indiana. If you are not a resident of Indiana, or if you're sending in a sample from out of state, it costs $22. So keep in mind, folks, that is cheap. That is cheap for some pretty complex lab work that needs to be done, because analyzing a fungus is definitely not an easy thing. So I just want to emphasize this is a service available to you, and I want you to take advantage of it. All right, so let's go ahead and sum this up. That was a lot of information that I went through really, really quickly. First and foremost, oak wilt is fatal, particularly to those oaks belonging to the red and black oak group. I would take some time and maybe identify some of the oaks around you right now, or once you're out of this program, obviously, and see what you have around you. Do you have high-risk trees near you? The disease has no cure, so you need to think about preventative measures. And if you are concerned about oak wilt in your area, then you want to get to work on that. And folks, oak wilt was initially identified in about 24 counties in Indiana, and I'm willing to bet it has probably spread since then. And what I also want you to do is consider engaging with professionals to try to see what options are available to you and to get things diagnosed properly to see if you actually do have oak wilt or if maybe you just have a decline issue that needs to be resolved. All right, with that, I want to thank everybody for coming by this evening.